Never Done Off with me, John Martin. Today's a current affairs video, and I want to give 6,500. I want to leave this number to dwell, 6,500. As I put fingers to keyboards when I was writing this script, 6,500 was the number of migrant workers who had died building the stadia and infrastructure for the Qatar World Cup. Since the time it was given the event by FIFA, and more on that later, an average of 12 people a week have died. If that carries on, we'll be looking at hundreds more dying in the desert heat. We hear tales of passports being taken away and other rights abuses of this migrant labour force. 6,500. What I want to look at today is how countries use sport to try and cover up from their patchy human rights record, and ask whether commercialism and desire for money is overcoming moral questions. I grew up in the 1980s and, my age is beginning to show. One key feature of sporting life in the 1980s was that South Africa had no part in it. Due to international outrage over its apartheid regime, most sports had chosen to have nothing to do with this country. Cricket, one of the country's major sports, boycotted for the 1970s, as did athletics. South African F1 Grand Prix was a warm weather opener and a low pressure party event, back in the day when F1 was still very much a party for today, for tomorrow we may die sport, that kicked off the season in early spring. Eventually, pressures from international governments and sporting bodies meant that almost every sport left South Africa isolated. I remember some of the controversies, such as Mike Gatting's Rebel Tour, and how the participants were left for years as sporting pariahs. And there was also the great celebrations when the South African rugby team, allowed back into the sport, won the World Cup. The team celebrated with Nelson Mandela, and the world celebrated too. 2020 will be remembered for many things, often tragic things. One of them was the killing of George Floyd, one of a sadly extensive list of black Americans killed by America's law enforcement community. The lone protest of NFL player Colin Kaepernick in kneeling for the national anthem became a common sight across sport as players, participants, teams, drivers all took the knee. And that's the problem solved, isn't it? Well, let's go to Formula One. The drivers, almost all, take a show of taking the knee at the start of each race after a call from world champion Lewis Hamilton. The commentators always say at this point in the event, it's to show that discrimination has no place in F1. Bollocks. Let's have a look at what is on the calendar for this year, 2021. We'll start off with the Bahrain Grand Prix, the calendar does. Human Rights Watch says this about Bahrain. Bahrain's human rights situation continues to be dire. Courts convict and imprison prominent human rights defenders and opposition leaders for their peaceful activism. Security forces ill-treat, threaten and coerce alleged suspects into signing confessions. Authorities have resumed executions, many after unfair trials marred by torture allegations, and failed to hold officials accountable for torture. Courts stripped the citizenship of hundreds, leaving many stateless, deported dozens of dissidents, journalists and lawyers as punishments for offences that include peaceful criticism of the government. Authorities in 2017 shut down the only independent newspaper in the country, as well as opposition parties. Spanish Grand Prix takes place in May at the circuit de Barcelona, Catalonia. Spanish Supreme Court convicted 9 pro-independence Catalan politicians and activists of sedition and sentenced them between 9 and 13 years for non-violent acts in connection with the 2017 referendum on independence previously deemed illegal by Spanish courts. Oil-rich Azerbaijan is on the calendar in June. Azerbaijan's government continues to wage a vicious crackdown on critics and dissenting voices. Azerbaijan also triggered the 2020 Nagorno-Karabakh war, which displaced over 100,000 civilians. France, also up in June, is coming to terms with its own Black Lives Matter protests, along with a litany of black people killed by the police. Hungary is up in August. Human Rights Watch say the Hungarian government fails to respect the rule of law and human rights. Civil organisations face legislative restrictions, while rights defenders, independent journalists are smeared by pro-government media. Academic freedom has been curbed and a top university forced out of the country. Government officials continue to engage in anti-migrant xenophobic rhetoric, including through publicly funded campaigns. Asylum seekers are detained and denied food in border camps, despite several European court rulings ordering Hungarian authorities to resume food distribution. Russian Grand Prix is in September, and while we'll return to Russia later on, we've seen how the Russian state has jailed opposition leader Alexei Navalny for missing a probation appointment because he was recovering in Germany from the Russian state having poisoned him. As well as making various cyber and disinformation attacks on other countries, it shouldn't also be forgotten they triggered a civil war in Ukraine and stole the whole of Crimea. Mexico is in October. Its security forces have been implicated in extrajudicial killings, disappearances and torture, and there's been some well-publicized cases of whole groups of people vanishing with Mexican drug cartels being suspected. Presidente Jair Bolsonaro of Brazil, November, is a cesspit of hateful views, be it on homosexuality, women, poor people, and political violence to achieve his ends. He also backs agro-businesses that are destroying the Amazon rainforest, and his policies are having a massive detrimental impact on the tribes that are still native to the Amazon region. Saudi Arabia returns to the calendar in December. Saudis have aggressive policies against women that have made news a number of times, as there has their support of the catastrophic war in Yemen. Critics of the Saudi regime, such as Jamal Khashoggi, have come to sad and cruel ends at the hands of the Saudi government and their agents. The Abu Dhabi Grand Prix in the United Arab Emirates follows the next week, and like the Saudis, they have oppressive rules against dissenters and have draconian rules against the LGBT plus community. So, there is no place in F1 for discrimination. And yes, I am well aware that I am doing this rundown from the UK, where an arch-populist right-wing government are trying to foster ill feeling towards former friends and allies, to mask the litany of their mistakes and have a shameful recent record on migrants being displaced from the various conflicts that we've had a hand in starting. And we also to try to disenfranchise a vast swathe of the electorate with a bogus voter ID scheme, the same plans that US courts have categorically called racist, despite there being no credible evidence of voter fraud. So, many of these F1 races, especially in the Middle East states, they're relatively new to the Formula One caravan. The vast income these states generate from their oil revenues allow them to build spectacular looking, if dull race-wise, circuits. The powers behind F1 are ready to grab as much cash as they can and let these countries pass themselves off as modern members of the elite Grand Prix Holders Club, hoping that images of Lewis, Sebastian and Max roaring around their spangly, dramatically lit circuits will make people think of them as desert oases and hope that nobody mentions their medieval human rights record. It's certainly suspicious, but not unsurprising, that drivers have very little to say about discrimination in these countries, while happy to show themselves taking a knee. It's not just in F1 that these countries are using sport to distract people from their abuses. Both Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates sponsor major cycling teams.
Bristol Street Motors are proud to overlook human rights abuses, discrimination against minorities, and murdering dissenters to present Formula One on Channel 4.
I want to look at a sport that outdoes even Formula One as a worldwide commercial enterprise. Football, or if you're American, it's still football, as all the players have to use their feet to kick a ball. And while we're going to look at international football in a moment, I want to look at club football. As an Everton fan who lives in Manchester, it was much bemusement in the early 2000s we had the Chinese derbies between Everton and their Chinese player Li Tai, and also Manchester City with their Chinese player Sun Ji-hai. These matches, shown between two mid-table sides, lurking in the shadow of their scarlet neighbours, brought in TV viewerships in excess of 300 million as the world's most populous nation tuned in for what were some rather insipid matches. This was the first signs of the commercial impact that China would have on sport. Let's fast forward to late 2019. An Arsenal star midfielder, Mesut Ozil, tweets about China's acts of genocide against the Uighur Muslims. The overreaction typical of the Chinese regime Broadcasting of Arsenal's match against City in the next couple of days was scrapped, and Ozil was taken out of Pro Evolution Soccer's 2020 game in China. Did Arsenal support their player? No, of course not. They said they remained apolitical because genocide is a political thing. The sheer size of the commercial market in China and how quick the authorities are to combat dissent means that both clubs and leagues will look to other way on human rights abuses to hold on to contracts that are worth hundreds of £1 million a year. Of course, it's not just football or sport that bows to commercial pressure in China. We can look at film. Even the mighty House of Mouse makes sure not to upset the delicate feelings of the Chinese government. As far back as 1997, Disney execs had to fly to China and apologise because Disney had a Martin Scorsese project, Kundun, about the Dalai Lama. The project is hidden in the vaults now. It's been suggested that the reason the notably non-Asian Tilda Swinton played the Ancient One in Doctor Strange was they didn't want to risk annoying China by having a Tibetan mystic in Tibet as a principal character of 2 of their major movies. Meanwhile, Disney are happy to film Mulan in Xinjiang, where the Uyghurs are being persecuted. And then China decided to crack down on Hong Kong, and the silence from the sporting world has been deafening. And while we're talking about Arsenal avoiding upsetting totalitarian regimes, we should note their shirt sponsor is Visit Rwanda. People may have watched the film Hotel Rwanda, where starred Don Cheadle was a hotel owner that saved over 1,000 refugees displaced by the horrific conflict in that country. The family's hotel owner, a critic of the current Rwanda president, say he was kidnapped from his hotel home in Dubai and taken to stand trial for terrorism and murder about 6 months ago. Earlier this year, the British Foreign Office criticised Rwanda for deaths in custody, enforced disappearances and torture. Now I just want to mention a sub-series of videos on the World War II in real-time channel run by Time Ghost History. Their War Against Humanity series is a must-watch, link in the description. A viewer said that they hate it. It makes them sick. But it's one of the most valuable series on YouTube. The series looks at the horrors inflicted on civilians by the warring parties, not only the Germans, but the Russians and the Japanese, and some of the allies like the US, although I and they are not comparing the US internment camps with the wholesale slaughters carried out by the Germans and Japanese forces. As someone with Lithuanian Jewish heritage, these descriptions of atrocities committed by Nazi forces and their allies in the Baltic states are sickening, haunting, but need to be heard by more and more people, so will never be repeated. So of course, the series, as well as some other documentaries, have been demonetized by YouTube. They may have plastered warnings about being labelled not suitable for advertisers. It doesn't stop YouTube sticking an advert on them and pocketing the money, but it's part of a trend that makes it very hard to properly make a high-quality documentary series looking at military history and some of the disturbing parts of human history that need to be remembered. Meanwhile, they're happy for umpteen millennials to release videos reacting to them having watched something about Mary for the first time. So, as I mentioned the Holocaust, I want to take us to the city of Lviv in present-day Ukraine. It was home to the third largest population of Jews in pre-war Poland. Just 1% of the 150,000 Jews that called this city and its environs home survived the Holocaust. The extermination was so efficient that Jews were brought in from other countries to be murdered there. Over 400,000 were killed. Over 100,000 Jewish children. 42 synagogues were destroyed. The remains of the last one, the Golden Rose, was left as a memorial to those who died before the 2012 UEFA Championships. It was covered up in hoardings. There were laws in Ukraine to protect historic sites. The remains of a designated UNESCO World Heritage Site. The hoardings went up. Bulldozers came in to make way for a hotel for the UEFA Football Championships.
David Luiz, Arsenal's star defender. We're calling him a defender now, really. Arsenal's star defender visited Rwanda and said this, that he was inspired by how fast we have become. We're a progressive, fast-growing nation with so many amazing things to see and do. He said he couldn't wait to come back and see even more of our beautiful country and how he was going to recommend it. All his friends spend their holidays in Rwanda, and we at Visit Rwanda recommend you come too. And of course, if you can't afford to travel to our beautiful country, just insult our president and we will send a gang to kidnap you from your house, stuff you in a jet and fly you back. Visit Rwanda, proud sponsors of Arsenal Football Club.
So we've seen that UEFA has no problems with countries destroying memorials to the victims of genocide to cash in on their sporting events. What about FIFA, the world's football governing body? Well, in December 2010, the 22-man FIFA executive came together in Zurich to pick the host of the 2018 and 2022 FIFA World Cups. In November 2010, the UN took a vote against countries undertaking extrajudicial killings of their citizens. This is fair enough. However, an amendment was tabled by Mali and Morocco on behalf of African and Arab countries that removed any reference to killing for sexual orientation from their resolution. To put it another way, if this resolution passed, the UN would be saying that it doesn't have an issue with countries killing their citizens for being gay. This is 2010, I remind you, just a decade ago. The amendment passed 79 to 70. 79 governments said it was fine to kill their citizens if they are gay. Of all the countries bidding to hold these two World Cups, it's 11 countries, only 2 backed the killing of LGBT plus people. And those 2 countries were, well, you guessed it was the winners, Russia and Qatar. There had been a huge amount of controversy over the choice of hosts, especially Qatar, where it's celebrated in some corners, opening up the football world. It was also mentioned in a lot of corners that the rich rulers of Qatar were in a position to financially influence many members of the committee, and that was how a repressive regime with no footballing infrastructure got awarded a tournament that couldn't be played at traditional time because of the intolerable desert heat, and so disrupt the footballing calendar, and many footballing fans, like those from the LGBT plus community, would be distinctly unwelcome. So this is why there are so many new stadiums needing to be built. New stadiums that will never be used by local clubs, so there isn't a supporter base for them. New stadium that would be defunct after a single use, at a time when the world is not only finally recognising the dangers of climate change, but how the construction industry plays a huge part in carbon release. So now we have 6,500 people having died building white elephants because the majority of the 22 FIFA executive officials were bribed to give a repressive nation a chance to show off for the world. And of course, the tournament comes around. Occasional news features may mention the issues, but everybody was so fixated on the football that nobody will notice companies will sell their soul to become official partners of the World Cup. They say daylight will out, but there is a difference with rich countries like China and South Africa in the 1980s. Companies and countries cannot afford to alienate China. Well, to be honest, nobody really cared about upsetting South Africa. You cannot imagine a film being released at any film studio these days that would be similar tone towards China as Lethal Weapon 2 was towards South Africa in 1989. You can't imagine any major sporting team refusing to tour China if invited. You can't imagine a footballer, an F1 driver, or they're like speaking out on this issue and getting full support from their team or club. And we've just had at the time of writing a scandal with a racehorse owner photographed on a dead horse. There are many questionable things about horse racing, especially the welfare of horses in national hunt races over jumps. But let's take a look at who owns these horses. According to the British Horse Racing Authority, the leading owner by earnings was Hamad bin Mohammed Al Maktoum, Crown Prince of Dubai in United Arab Emirates. His sister is Princess Latifa bin Mohammed Al Maktoum, who is currently believed to be being held against her will on orders of her father after an Emirates/Indian operation took her from a yacht in international waters. Talking of her father, the ruler of Dubai, Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum, he owns the second place stables Godolphin Sheikh Mohammed was also implicated in a case where he was accused of kidnapping and enslaving children to act as jockeys in camel racing. The fourth place owner is another billionaire member of the Dubai royal family, the ruler's uncle, Ahmed bin Saeed Al Maktoum, honorary Knight Commander of the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire. Again, as owners of racehorses, they get access to many people at the top of British society and allows them lots of good press via racing journalists, happy to gloss over the human rights abuses that these people are responsible for overseeing. What can we do? Well, let's take a look at doping because, well, if this video goes on much longer, I'm going to need it. The World Anti-Doping Agency banned Russia for competing in all major events for 2 years. Russian athletes have not been able to compete as Russian in any athletics event since 2015. This is because, like many regimes, Russia and Putin use the country's sporting success to decide how Russians are superior and how regime of Putin is a successful regime. And to make sure they won, there was a major doping regime going on. At the Sochi Winter Olympics, the process to fool anti-doping procedures was an industrial level scheme. So we can see that there is an appetite for banning countries. And even then, the Russian ban was cut from 4 years to 2 years. In the days of the ancient Olympics, it was said that all wars would cease for the games. And we could ask, why can't the modern Olympics just stop countries competing if they're engaged in conflicts? And we can say this doesn't have to be actual international conflicts, but it can be internal. Or internal conflict, this can be full-on wars against civilians or one-sided discriminations against minorities. Well, I think it is fair that Russia is banned from the Tokyo Olympics because of their doping violations. Is it fair that China can compete while trying to exterminate the culture of a whole population? Why can't we start more South Africa-style boycotts? If International Athletics Association took the same stance on LGBT rights as they did with apartheid in South Africa, then suddenly Jamaica, Kenya, Uganda would not be able to compete. If FIFA limited Brazil's involvement in international football, would that have an effect on the country's retrograde policies? And yes, it's more than just banning sporting competition that will change minds, but at some point we need to stop celebrating the achievements of countries in competing or hosting whose attitudes to their minorities or their neighbours have no place in the 21st century. Is there a case for keeping politics out of sport? Maybe. But national sport has always played a part in national politics. So here are some questions for the comments. Is sport too commercial for organisations to risk alienating major governments? Is sport too commercial for organisations to care? Does FIFA really care where its World Cup is staged so long as Coca-Cola will partner them? As long as McDonalds and Budwiser are still happy to be World Cup sponsors, despite thousands of deaths their sponsorship is based on, will FIFA change? With Visa, Intel, Panasonic, Toyota among the Olympic sponsors, will they risk their Chinese market share by calling on the International Olympic Committee to block Chinese athletes competing until China stops its crackdown? Remember, the next Winter Olympics is in Beijing. I've been John Martin. Thank you for listening. If you have any views in this, please comment. Please like, share, subscribe. And until the next time.
For nearly 150 years, we at Budwiser have been selling our brown, alcoholic water to sports fans who want to pretend they drink real beer. Over the past decade, we've seen a sales slump that, surprisingly, wasn't arrested last year. After all, if you think about it, if you've lost your sense of taste, then real beer tastes exactly the same as Budwiser. And let's face it, with lockdown putting paid to most of your beach holidays, Budwiser is about as close to water as you're going to get. Despite our financial issues, countless cases of corruption within FIFA, and the deaths of thousands, we are committed sponsors of the 2022 World Cup.